Plan risk responses is the process of developing options, selecting strategies, and agreeing on actions to address overall project risk exposure, as well as to treat individual risks. Some important terminology within this process. A contingency plan is a planned risk response that is implemented in response to a particular risk event occurring. This term can also be used for an alternative set of actions and tasks available in the event that the primary plan needs to be abandoned for any reason, which is called a fallback plan. The use of a fallback plan is contingent on the primary plan failing. I like to use the example of going on a camping trip. If we have a situation where the weather gets entirely too cold and the sleeping bag is just not keeping you warm, you can go ahead and start a small campfire. This would be the contingency plan. If you're unable to find any amount of wood that's dry enough to start a fire, then you can always go back to your car, drive to a hotel, and this would be a fallback plan. We are abandoning part of the project. Now, there is still a residual risk, even if we start that campfire. A residual risk is a risk that remains after responses have been implemented. Starting a campfire does not necessarily mean that we're going to be warm. We can also introduce a secondary risk. A secondary risk is one that arises as a direct result of implementing a risk response. Prior to starting that campfire, the risk of a forest fire was very low. However, by introducing that fire, all of a sudden we've now introduced a secondary risk. With escalate, certain criteria must be defined as part of that risk management plan to make a determination when would escalation be appropriate. Typically, this is when it would be outside of the scope of the project to deal with the results of a risk event, or if the impact would be so significant that there's no way that the project manager would be able to take care of it himself. For avoiding or exploiting, this is typically used when we've identified a risk event that is either severe in impact or very lucrative in impact. So we decide that we will change some aspect of the project to either make it go away or to make sure that it does happen. Transfer and share both refer to shifting risk to a third party. Transfer is when we're dealing with a threat. This could be done through the purchase of an insurance policy. Sharing is done when we have an opportunity. Perhaps we don't have enough resources organic to our organization or our capacity is too limited, so we have a teaming agreement with someone. Mitigation and enhance both deal with trying to manipulate the probability or impact of specific risk events without fully eliminating them. And with acceptance, we have passive and active. Passive acceptance refers to just the acknowledgement and documentation of a risk event, whereas active acceptance would be the actual assignment of contingency reserves. When preparing contingent response strategies, the project team should consider all of the circumstances that surround the potential risk event occurring. They should look for potential warning signs, trigger symptoms, or anything else that could kind of give us a heads up that a risk event is about to occur. We could have multiple strategies and multiple plans for a single risk event based upon whatever type of circumstance could be occurring when that risk event comes to fruition. We could also develop strategies for overall project risk. And these could be the same types of strategies that we just saw for opportunities and threats, just at a larger scale. Outputs from this process include change requests and the project management plan updates. If we find ourselves using a more proactive risk response strategy, such as avoiding or exploiting, where we're changing some aspect of the plan to either eliminate a threat or ensure that a opportunity will occur, then we would modify the project management plan somehow. This would be done through formal integrated change control using a change request. Project documents updates include the risk register updates. At this point, we have a very thoroughly prepared risk register with a lot of information on it. We have our identified risk with a narrative description of them, the area of the project that we believe that they will affect, and we could tie this to the work breakdown structure. There's specific causes, and we can look at the resource breakdown structure and how they may affect project objectives, and we can evaluate impact against any one of the objectives or multiple objectives. The risk owners should have been assigned, and we should have their assigned responsibilities as well, such as the periodic reassessments and the frequency with which they will do so. We can again reprioritize this list of risks based upon that qualitative and quantitative analysis, and also now based upon the responses that we've prepared and what we believe their effectiveness could be should that risk event occur. We'll document our agreed upon response strategies and the specific actions that we will have to implement with these strategies should the risk event occur. Any triggers, symptoms, or warning signs of risk occurrence should be documented as well for the risk owner's benefit. Fallback plans should be prepared in case the contingency plans prove to be ineffective. Any residual or leftover risk and secondary side effect risk should be documented as well. And finally, our contingency reserves. We need to ensure that an appropriate amount of funding is set aside and included as part of the cost estimates. There's some other documents that could be updated as well, including the assumptions log. As we're performing this process, new assumptions may be made and we may have modification to existing assumptions. The lessons learned register. The risk report should be updated as we have more information about specific risk events. The project schedule, project team assignments, and cost forecasts. There are two types of reserves, and it's very important to know the difference between them. A contingency reserve is set aside for known unknowns, or identified risk. These are risks that we have identified, they are on the risk register, and we have decided to deal with them through the application of contingency reserves. These are risks that can be foreseen. Since they can be foreseen, we have identified them. These reserves can be set aside for both time and cost. They will be part of the schedule or cost baseline and are owned by the project manager who has the authority to apply them as necessary. Management reserves are for unknown unknowns. These are unidentified risk. These are not on the risk register. These are for unforeseeable risks to the entire project. When we say unforeseeable, it would not be reasonable to assume that the project manager should have identified and included these risk events on the risk register. Now, these reserves could also be for time and cost, but they are not included in the schedule or cost baseline. These reserves are owned by management. When we say management, we mean the senior management of the organization. So it may be the sponsor, maybe the project management office, it could be somebody at the corporate level, but it's going to be somebody above the project manager. This is where we'd have to use a response strategy of escalate in order to access these reserves. To give you an example of the difference between contingency reserves and management reserves, we can think about a severe storm. If we set aside 3 days of schedule reserve to deal with inclement weather, that would be a contingency reserve. We have identified the possibility of inclement weather causing schedule delays, and we have addressed it accordingly. However, if it ends up being a 7-day long storm, which is very uncommon, that would be an unforeseeable risk. It would not be reasonable to expect the project manager to have known that this was possible if that's not normal for the local area. Plan risk responses, learning assessment. The action plan we develop for each individual risk will be documented in the risk register. And the action plan we develop for the overall project risk will be documented in the risk report. Exploit, enhance, and share our strategies for positive risk, and avoid, transfer, and mitigate our strategies for negative risk. Which strategies can be applied to both positive and negative risk? Escalate and accept are used for both. Each risk response should be entrusted to a risk owner, true or false? This is true. If we don't have a risk owner, then we have nobody to implement the risk response should that risk event occur. What is the difference between residual risk and secondary risk? Residual risk is uncertainty remaining even after a response strategy is implemented. Secondary risk arises solely because of the response strategy being implemented.